whenever.
On.
There we go. So hello all and welcome to Active Directory. So I'm going to be going through some of the what is Active Directory, why we want to use it, some of the plot holes and security issues with it, and then moving into some more ways that you can defend against it and some of the plot holes that are already in there. So as per usual, our standard disclaimer applies.
Standard disclaimer, please don't use anything.
Please don't use anything that we are going to be showing you or ways that you can exploit this or ways to target your attack on an Active Directory. This is only for educational purposes, yada, 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 our standard disclaimer. So I am getting slight bits of double audio. I don't know whether that's through Discord or not. So Ryan, can you strap your stream? Yeah, thank you. So what we'll be covering today, as I say, what is Active Directory, some bits on how to install it, because there are some big plot holes that you can find when installing Active Directory to do with a bunch of DNS settings and then security issues. So first of all, what is Active Directory? Active Directory is a single management platform for Windows users, is a very, very simplified version of way of explaining it. So it means that you don't have to remember 25 different passwords and usernames for 25 different computers in 25 different locations. So if you go into the library at the university, you don't have to log into a different one. So let's say if you go into CIS bottom floor, web tech, or somewhere else, it is a single user account that's then shared across multiple machines. It will sync all of your data, so whether that be from OneDrive or your email clients, all of that things are single management, single sign-on, and then also give you permissions to certain things. So whether it be a file share, different programs in different rooms, it's not just about the user side of it. You can also do computer management. So if you go into a games lab, for example, you can have a bunch of BattleNet installed on there and all of the games lab dedicated programs. And it can be incredibly useful for making sure that only machines that are powerful enough to do certain tasks are installed with those programs. And then a mandatory, like you have to have it installed for using ADDS, which is off-network, off-domain resources. So think of these as web browser things that you sign into using your university username and password. So these are ADDS or off-domain, off-of-campus websites that are using single sign-on. So I've mentioned what single sign-on is, but it can also be used for a lot of other things. So it can automatically be used to give users VPNs when they log into machines. So if you have to log on to a VPN to be able to access internal resources, it can be used to authenticate that. SCCM is the program management side of it. All of your Office suite, whether that be emails, Word documents, everything like that, synced, printed, shared file storage. The biggest one that we're interested in is the security management. So instead of going around and having to manage security, whether that be passwords or what users can access computers on every machine on campus, we can manage them all from a big central location, which is incredibly useful when you start thinking about you're dealing with 10 users, 100 users, 1,000 users, or 50 computers. You don't want to have to go around and change every single password on one of those machines when an employee leaves. So having this single sign-on system is incredibly useful. So I am just going to whiz through installing Active Directory in the DNS server for your Windows server. So you will need a Windows Server image, but you can get a free one from the university download section through Azure. If you want to go away and start working and looking at some of this Active Directory kind of stuff on Windows Server, you can go away onto their website and manage to pull the image. it has a lot of modules, Windows Server. You can make it do a lot of things, from everything from Hyper-V, which is your sort of like virtualization platform within Windows, to a full network stack where it's giving out network addresses, it's giving out IP addresses, it's giving out all domain services. But the ones that we're interested in are your DNS servers and your Active Directory. So once those modules have installed, they do take quite a while. You can also be installing any other server-related programs that runs natively on Windows in the background. So setting up your DNS server, it needs to be given somewhere to look for DNS things that it can't find, because you're going to be pointing your clients at the server as a DNS. So they need to know where to go to get something if they can't, like if it isn't stored locally. So you've got to automatically scavenge old records. What this means is it deletes things that are older than 7 days and give it a forwarder. So I've given it my own internal DNS forwarder. Then you've got to go through and create a subnet. So this is so if you are using VPNs, you can give it multiple subnets so that when clients connect, it can use NAT or PAT address translation to give put just ports out to your overall internet. But I'm not going to be doing that. I'm giving everything their own IP and networking settings. So if I am going too fast, please just say something in the chat. But as I say, I'm whizzing through this so we can get to the slightly more interesting part, which is the security side of it. So once you've done that, you've got to create users. So normally these are created in the users tab, but if we want to set this up like we would a real industrial network, we need what are called organizational units, or OUs. And these are sort of like folders that you are putting users in, and you can have subfolders, sub-organizational units, and give each one a set of permissions. So for me, I am getting what is called a Windows admins group. So in other words, domain admins, or the top level of permissions in the Windows architecture, which means I have access to absolutely everything. I can change every setting on the domain controller or the Windows server, along with having access to everything on all of the individual client machines. So if I was going to have to go and do updates on a particular machine that I couldn't do through Windows Server, I would use my domain account so that it has the permissions to install programs and the like. And if you are then setting up a general user, you would create subfolders for, let's say, IT services. They would have more permissions than your generic user because they need to be able to administer their job differently. So here's a screenshot of what admin groups are. So at the moment, I just have 2 user groups. I have domain admins and domain users. Domain admins, as I say, have access to absolutely everything. Domain users are majoritively what every other person in the organization will be using. So these domain users have much lower permissions. So we need to give our newly created admin, domain admin, and remove old user groups from accounts that don't need them. So when we are creating normal users, I've just created a sub organizational unit called accounts, and then a sub one in that called normal users. This means that I can start to branch out on my own internal domain and have different levels of accounts, which is more easy for us to understand and also more secure. So every user that you create should have a mandatory password change when they log on. And as you can understand, this is so that we don't know the password to every person that is going to be logging on. Network security. So this is on your client machine, the VM or machine that you are pointing at your domain controller. These are the DNS settings. So what we're doing here is pointing our DNS settings of our clients to the domain controller. This means that when they call out and say, I am looking for my example, my domain is called Doghouse. when I say they call out and say I'm looking for the domain controller of Doghouse, the PC immediately finds it because it is the first stop. I did try and set up Linux-based forwarding, but it wasn't very happy with me, so I ended up going with this method. The PC has to be on a trusted network or discoverable. So what that means is when you connect your machine to a new network, it comes up with that thing saying, do you want this PC to be discoverable on your work and home networks? Do not pick this for public locations. That needs to be enabled for this to all work, because it has to have certain protocols enabled and running to be able to find and look at the domain controller. There's quite a lot of settings here that have to be manually changed. So all of these settings are disabled by default. So append parent suffix, register suffix, all of these settings have to be ticked so that they are registered on your actual domain controller's DNS, which is what we were setting up a few slides ago. There we go. So once all of that's set up, you are going to be going into your computer domain settings. By default, this is called workgroup. So when you don't have a machine signed to a domain, it is in just a generic workgroup. What we are going to be saying is go and look for our domain. So this can be anything that you wanted to create. For me, I just called it Doghouse because it matches all of my server naming schemes and computer naming schemes. You need to log into the account using a non-admin account. So what I mean by that is when you have entered your primary suffix and told the computer to log in, you are going to need to enter your username and password. So I would recommend not using your domain admin, just to make sure that your low-level accounts are working and all of the permissions are correct for registering the domain and linking the computer to the domain. Once this has happened, we will need to restart the machine. So once we have got the welcome to XXX whatever domain.local, you need to restart the machine so that it can log on. So when you've entered this logon state, you will be presented with your standard user and also your new domain user. So as you can see here, it is saying, what user do you want to sign into the Doghouse domain? If we want to log onto the local machine again, we can. But for this instance, we are logging into the new domain to make sure that all of the settings have cross-synced and made sure that it actually is working. So this domain username and domain password are whatever you use to sign up. Once you're in, you will be presented with the standard new Windows logon screen. So we've all had this. It is the incredibly slow process of we're getting everything ready for you, we're installing programs, we're making sure that Cortana is enabled or disabled or all of these other little things. So once that slow process has finished, it will log you into your account. And you will always need to make sure that you are logged in by using the cmd command who am I, and make sure that you are actually logged into your domain. And it should always work. But most of the time, I haven't had an issue once I've got to this point. So that was a very, very quick breeze through of installing AD and getting a machine added to the domain in a couple of minutes. So now I'm going to talk through some of the most common security issues with AD. Because as you can imagine, having all of your user and authentication methods in one basket can leave a lot of holes or problems if it isn't set up correctly. So the biggest one is having too many domain admins. So domain admins, as I was saying, can change absolutely every setting under the sun, and having too many of those, if one person gets compromised from a phishing attack, from getting their password cracked, from any of these other things, it gives them full access to every part of the domain. This can even happen if you are what's called an insider threat. So someone within the organization decides that they aren't being treated right, or they have a bone to pick with the organization, and they use their authenticated accounts for malicious purposes, whether that be stealing information to resell or whatever it is. Another one can be leaving inactive accounts. So inactive accounts are people that have left your organization and they just haven't had the machine, like their account disabled or their account deleted. As you can imagine, this is a lot easier when you're using AD or Active Directory, because it can just be as simple as going into the user and clicking disable. If you had to go around all 1,000 computers, most of the computers would get missed. Relaxed password policies. So by default, the Active Directory requires what in their view is a secure password. Their secure password is not overly secure. So their secure password must contain 3 out of the 4 categories, which we all love, which is an uppercase, a lowercase, number, or whatever. But they only require you to have a minimum of 6 characters in that password length. So 6 characters, as you can remember, or you might be able to remember from our brute forcing section, is incredibly, incredibly easily done. So you can go away and change these policies later. But another big thing is having inherited permissions. So as I was saying about organizational units are just folders, and you can have folders in folders. Users are unaware, or admins are unaware, when you get to 5 or 6 groups, what permissions are actually applied to which group. And you can have groups that contradict each other, and then all of a sudden you have permissions for users that they really shouldn't, or overarching policies, and which are permissions for all users. So ways we can start reducing down some of these attack surfaces are having tiers of users. So as you saw when I was setting it up, I had accounts, and then I had normal users, and then you can start making new tiers for IT, for HR, which all have permissions to different shares, for instance, so that HR can only access HR shares, IT can't access HR shares. All of these tiered permissions, having as few domain admins as possible, or these super admins as possible. If you can get away with just having one domain account, only have one domain account. Because if you have your secondary account, which is probably the biggest and most differentiating change that you'll see, it's incredibly useful. So when I say having a secondary account, I probably haven't explained that very well. So a secondary account is you have an account for your day-to-day activity, for your emails, for doing your general Word documents, for browsing the web. Then you have a second account known as a privileged account. So this account doesn't have email, doesn't have Word documents, doesn't have any file storage, and is only used for administration activities. So whether that be a domain admin account, which I don't recommend, or whether it just be an account that has some extra permissions, so whether it be permission to change DNS or whatever permissions that one individual user needs, their secondary account has that, and their primary account, the one that they do all their emails and everything on, is as locked down as possible. And then also reducing the amount of people that can even see where the domain controller is. So this might be putting it on an isolated VLAN. This might be putting it in the cloud and having it restricted access via IPs through Azure's Active Directory. This can be a whole number of things, but it means restricting the amount of people that even can see or try and access your domain controllers. So you can all have a look at what your password policy is at the moment. So your password policy is your second biggest point of entry. So the first one is having secondary accounts, but it doesn't help if those secondary accounts have a 6-character password. So this probably looked a little bit confusing for most people, so I'll try and go through and explain it. So This complexity enable just means, is it 6 characters? Is it using 3 or 4? Yes or yes. Like, yes or no. Can you be locked out of your account? If you enter a password wrong X amount of times, how long do you get locked out for? As you can see, that's disabled by default. So it doesn't matter how many attempts that we try and get into. If we sit there for long enough, we can get in because there's no way of locking, there's no lockout enabled. The oldest a password can be is 42 days. The minimum a password can be is a day, minimum length, yada, 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 and reversible encryption. So we've all looked at what reversible encryption is. It means, can I take your MD5 hash and reverse it? By default, this is disabled, which we are always going to leave disabled. This history password count, or password history count, is an interesting one. So when a user is required to change their password, it will compare their new password against all of their previous passwords, or the number of previous passwords this value set to. So if you have password 1, password 2, password 3, you won't be able to go all the way back to password 1 until you've got all the way to password 25, and then you'll be allowed to re-enter password 1. But as always, all of these password policies can be changed in what's called group policy. So it's quite a few layers deep to actually find the password policy, but once you're there, you can see all of these reversible encryption and you can mouse over them to find out what they say. And I've done something here that is quite contrary to what a lot of people believe passwords should be, and that's setting the maximum password age to indefinite. Because I'm only going to be using this domain for sort of like testing intermittently, it's going to be shut down for most of the time when I'm not using it. Having this password never expire just means that when I reboot the machine, I won't have to go and enter a brand new password every time, like once a month when I actually decide to use it. So having these password policies change to suit whatever your local environment is going to be. If you're going to be using this every day and it's forward facing on the internet, then maybe set some of these password lengths to be a bit longer. So whether they be 10, 12, 15 characters or something like that, you can start customizing this to your own stuff. Disabling old accounts as well. This is a very easy feature to do in the password policy. And in the domain controller, I'm just booting up, trying to log into my domain controller right now, so that I can show you how easy it is just to disable some of these old accounts. But it's demo gods are telling me to wait. Oh yeah, gotta love the demo gods. I'll leave that on the other screen and continue talking, and I'll go back to that in a minute once it's decided whether or not it's going to load. Because at the moment, it's deciding it doesn't really want to. Oh, sorry, I just coughed as well. There we go. Looks like I remember why. Because I'm streaming on mobile Wi-Fi, I am no longer connected to my local domain. So therefore, I have to connect back to my local domain if it decides it wants to. There we go. Sorry about that. Yep, all of my things are named so that I actually know where they are. All of my different accounts. But yeah, so whilst that boots, sorry about that. That'll have to reconnect. But disabling old accounts can be incredibly, incredibly easy. So sometimes it's as simple as just clicking a button like here. Okay, my domain controller's booted now. And I will just log in. So whether that be as simple as going into the user profile, going to the account, and going down to disable account, apply, it would then stop this user being able to log into the doghouse domain, which, as you can think, is quite useful when someone leaves the company just to be able to go in and disable them. It's again with organizational units. You can go into groups and start adding different partitions and telling them what they can and can't do, drilling down into a group of users and disabling a group of users at a time. Whether this person needs to change their password the next time they log on. So if you believe that their account has been compromised, you can start changing their passwords for them and creating more secure accounts for individual users, all from this single panel of Active Directory. Going back to my presentation quickly. Another method that is incredibly useful that most people will never think of is adding two-factor authentication to user logons. So we all use two-factor authentications for our online personas and our social medias, everything like that. But you can actually, yeah, if you don't, you should. And using strong, long, complicated, unique passwords. But if you don't, that's fine. You can start implementing those. But you can add two-factor authentication to Windows boxes. And Ryan, there is a script for adding them to SSH logins, I believe. Yeah. So, yeah, it can be installed on most platforms. I don't believe it's available on Mac at the moment, but it will be coming out later this year. Yeah, no one's using Macs, right, guys? But yeah, two-factor authentication, you can have it so that every time you RDP, or which is the remote logon protocol for Windows, or log on to via your straight logon, requires two-factor authentication. This is incredibly useful for reducing the attack surface of your machine. So even just putting this on a domain controller cuts the attack surface down by such a drastic amount that all of a sudden it doesn't matter if they well, it will matter if they get your password, but it adds that extra layer of security. Security is all about layers of defense. So if they get past your firewall, then they have to guess your password. If they guess your password, they have to get past 2FA. If they get past 2FA, they might have an account that doesn't have enough permissions to start changing settings or privilege escalate. If they manage to privilege escalate, you've only got one super domain account that again has another two-factor authentication on it. And all of these different layers of security slowly build up in Active Directory and can be implemented incredibly easily in Active Directory. And these layers will slowly build up and make it so that your security system is harder to get into. But if someone does manage to get into it and starts messing around with settings, logging everything that your users are doing, not in a Big Brother, what keys are they pressing, like full-on keyware analytics, but just logging what actions are being undertaken by users and throwing errors if they're doing something that they normally don't. So at a place where I used to work, this was caught quite a lot. So we had one of those insider threats that I was mentioning earlier, where someone decided that they were going to take some sensitive company data and sell it or post it online. And all of a sudden, we started to see them downloading huge amounts of data and trying to access shares that they didn't have permissions for. And this was all done through the logging activity. So all of a sudden, they were opening PowerShell when this user has never used PowerShell in their life. They probably don't even know what it is, but they read an article somewhere online. So they started opening up PowerShell and trying commands. And all of it was logged. And then all of a sudden, it was incredibly easy for the security team at the time to go through and say, okay, what are you doing? You're opening up or you're trying 10 different passwords from users that aren't you onto different shares. Explain what you're doing, kind of thing. And they managed to get that account locked down incredibly quickly. So logging account and accountability of changes that are made is hugely important. So all of this can be done by default at the moment and will be happening in what's called your event viewer. So Event Viewer is installed on every single Windows machine and is enabled by default. And you have a bunch of different what are called notebooks, for lack of a better term, and they show you errors, they show you warnings, they show what applications are doing what, if there's been a security something, if you've updated, and when you go to your security tab, what logged on, what user, what machine. And Active Directory takes this to another level. So if you go to your your domain controller, you can start looking at the event viewer if it decides to load in a second. He says, there we go. I am running this on a very slow hard drive along with a bunch of other VMs. So it is incredibly slow, and I am quite sorry for that, but it will load in a second. He says it doesn't load. I think the VM crashed. Yay! Demo. I know. I'll try just reopening it. Opening another Windows machine. There we go. Okay, opening up another Windows machine. See if this one works any better. But if not, you get the general idea of all of these logs can be moved into a single sort of logging system and correlated and then maybe exported to something else. Let's say this one's a bit speedier. He says then this one crashes. But yeah, you can export all of these logs to a SIEM solution like I was going over last week for the OSI Alien Vault SIEM. You can start outputting all of this data and making a large single point so that you can monitor all of your data. But yes, the demo gods have decided that I must do that in Discord. So I will get that sorted for Discord in a minute. But yeah, so once you start implementing these 5 or 6 different things into your Active Directory, you can make Active Directory incredibly safe, incredibly secure. Sorry about that. But yeah, you can make everything secure. You can make everything more easily accessible. And this is useful for us as security practitioners to be able to understand Active Directory. Because when we are messing around with 5 or 6 machines, or we are using a couple of VMs to test malware or like open programs and have new devices installed with Windows so that we can test a script to install something, we want to be able to not have to remember 55,000 different user logons and credentials and make everything unique. Means that it makes it quite difficult for all of us to be able to do the weird things that we want to be able to do with multiple Windows installs. So I hope all of that made sense. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I will go through and show it now that my domain is slowly up and running. I'm going to close a couple of VMs in the background just to give it a bit more bandwidth. But here's a quick one to show you if it decides that it wants to run. No, demos are dying. So if there's anything else that you want covered, I will be in Discord to answer them. But if not, we will be talking about the general cybersecurity news this week, like a huge data center going up in flames without having data replication, and also thousands of Tesla and DoD and Department of Corrections security cameras all being released live onto the internet. So we're going to be covering those in the Cyber Clinic Discord channel that we will be linking. And if not, I hope you enjoyed this week, and have a nice rest of your week.